My name is Emily Swafford. I'm Director of Academic and Professional Affairs at the American Historical Association in Washington, D.C. And it is my real pleasure to welcome you all today to TAs in the Time of COVID, which is part of our online teaching forum, part of Virtual AHA, the suite of virtual events and programming that the AHA is doing instead of our annual meeting this year. I'm very excited to have you all join us, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion of the panelists. So I'm going to just go over a few logistical details before we jump into the webinar, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists to take it from there. So first, all participants, all attendees are muted. So if you run into any technical issues, please use the chat box and the AHA staff will do their best to assist you. Because the chat is reserved for technical issues, as you come up with questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A function in Zoom. You can start doing that now if you already know that you have a question. We will hope to address all relevant questions that are submitted that way, but we will be mindful of timekeeping. And a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording after the live session. And a reminder as well that by registering for this AHA's web-based event, participants and panelists have agreed to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Alix Huey, who is an associate professor at Mississippi State University and also a counselor on the AHA's teaching division. And she will be moderating today's conversation, TAs in the Time of COVID. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. And I want to thank the AHA certainly for putting this webinar together and hosting this whole series of webinars. They've been really fascinating. And then to thank the panelists, of course, for joining us, and to thank all of you. I know there's lots of things to distract us and demand our attention these days. So I want to quickly introduce the panelists here, and then we'll just kind of dive right in. Noah Dolim is a fourth year at University of California at Irvine. His research focuses on Native Hawaiian women's clubs in Hawaii during the Progressive Era, and he's actually beaming in from Hawaii right now. John Wendt is a fifth year PhD candidate, I believe, at Texas A&M. And his research focuses on the U.S. Army Quartermaster Department's use and abuse of credit in procurement and supply during the mid-19th century. Jim Geeson is a colleague of mine at Mississippi State University, an associate professor of environmental and agricultural history. He focuses on the U.S. South, and he's been recognized for a number of awards for his books and articles, and recently was awarded the Mississippi State University's highest teaching honor, the Grisham Master Teacher Award. And his PhD students, I mean, they're like the pride of our department. They've won a number of nationally competitive dissertation awards and pre-doc fellowships. So he's also a very good grad advisor in addition to undergrad teacher. Jennifer Sessions is an associate professor in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She's a historian of modern France and French colonialism, and also a devoted poodle mother. She teaches courses in French, European, and global imperial history, including survey courses in modern European and world history. I would note also, I asked all the panelists to take a position on whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich, and some of them did and some of them didn't. So if you want to pursue that line of questioning later in the panel, we can do that. So I wanted to start with, I guess, a question for Noah and John. And because, you know, again, the TAs, especially in the sort of early transition back in March when everyone sort of rapidly had to shift to online teaching, they were on the front lines. So I was hoping you all could talk a bit about what that transition looked like, you know, your experience as a TA as the pandemic really exploded, and what changed about the job, both in March, but then also, you know, now in the fall.
So hi, everyone. Thank you all for attending this online session. And before I begin, I'll also say that a hot dog is a sandwich. My transition, like I think most people, it was a whirlwind. UC Irvine is on the quarter system. So right when everything was kind of changing, we were in the final week of our winter quarter. It was actually like the weekend before the last week of the quarter and finals week. So we went from an in-person final to an online final. And then that Sunday, administration tells us that we also have the option to let students opt out of the final. So it was a lot of this adjusting pretty much every day to new policies, new information. That week, I think that whole weekend, I remember just getting, it was constant emails from all of my students. What's going on? What's happening? And then I think the undergrads also got sent home. So a lot of them had to go back to their houses, some in California, some in other states. Some of them, I remember, didn't have good internet. So a lot of them were worried about taking an online test. But it all kind of got sorted out. And unfortunately at UCI, we also only have 1 week of spring break. So it was, again, trying to plan the next quarter within 1 week. But I was TAing for another professor who was really, really organized, which came in with a really strong game plan. And that made the transition hopefully or tried to be as seamless as possible. We had a few hiccups, but it was quite smooth. I think the biggest thing, obviously, is not having that face-to-face interaction, the in-person interaction. Going to an online format. In that second class, we didn't have discussion sections. So for me, I really missed working with the students in that one-on-one or larger group setting. And that's kind of like my favorite part of TAing. So I really missed that part. But for me, it was just really challenging. And how do you keep students interested in an online format? How do you make sure that you're still achieving the same outcomes that you would or similar outcomes that you would in a in-person setting? But yeah, that's kind of my experience. Just a whirlwind of craziness.
That gives me a real good jumping off point, Noah. Thank you. So again, thank you everybody for joining. My name's John Wendt once again. So I actually dodged the bullet in spring. I was on an internship in Washington, D.C. at the time and didn't come back until this fall. And just at the same time, Texas A&M decided to switch its teaching tools from eCampus to Canvas and caught everybody off guard. And I'm not going to take a side in case there's a Canvas rep in the crowd. But I will say it was very difficult to have to learn an entire new system when I had done 4 years of eCampus, and then have the students learn it, have all the faculty learn it. I know for a fact TAs weren't given the same access to faculty training tools at first. So there was just a lot of sort of confusion. But I will say on the other hand, it helped sort of ground the TA faculty sort of relationship, and that we were both taking this on together at the same time, very much, sort of fist and glove type approach to this, where, I've essentially, for my class, for instance, I've essentially become the IT person, which isn't something I'm trained in, but it allowed the professor I'm working with to really focus on how to retailer his content to the Canvas module system, which anybody who uses Canvas knows what I'm talking about. And it allowed me to sort of figure out how best to, dispense that to the students, I guess. And it's been a learning process. I probably have put more hours in this year than I have in several years, trying to figure out how to make that work. And I will say I'm very grateful that we have a lot of tech savvy students who are more than willing to send me emails at 3 a.m. saying that I haven't posted the grades yet, or they can't see this, they can't see that, which has been very helpful this time around. I think that might be a little bit annoying going forward, but everybody's very much on the same page, and that, I think is at least a net positive in all this craziness. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. I like this idea. I mean, both of you sort of talk about this sense of we're all in this together, that I think there's a sort of sense of community kind of across the entire institution, where people, I think, are you know, despite the incredible amount of stress that the pandemic has caused, there is, I think, a sense of sympathy and sort of willingness to, you know, be flexible that hopefully continues. I want to, I guess, turn maybe now to Jim. And so Jim teaches is currently teaching a very large multi-section intro to US history here at MSU. And so Jim, could you tell us a bit more about how the pandemic has changed sort of, I guess, what you need from TAs in order to ensure that undergraduate students are learning in this totally weird setting? And maybe you can also talk about your totally weird setting in which you are teaching them.
Yeah, let me start with the setting because it's definitely unique. So I didn't teach in the spring and was watching as all my colleagues were trying to figure out how to make it through the end of the semester. And then in May, I got an email from my department head that said, hey, would you be interested in teaching in the basketball arena? We're thinking about that as one of the options. And basically, you know, the focus was, at least, I'll give you the university's narrative of this, and we can take it or poke holes in it. But anyway, the narrative is that the university was getting all this word from students who wanted to return to campus. So this is over the summer, right? So all these students wanted face-to-face classes. So the university said, okay, well, we're trying to scramble to make that happen. And they did. They bunch of like staff people in kind of out of the public view jobs, people in the technology department, people in the registrar's office, like basically rebuilt our entire infrastructure of our campus, redid our campus schedule and everything else to make these face-to-face classes work. And to get to my class, having a huge arena with 900 students in it, which is what I'm doing, meant that you could have a ton of face-to-face classes or face-to-face, you know, hours, students having face-to-face classes in one place, and to sort of take pressure off the face-to-face load in lots of other classes where it was more difficult, upper division classes, chemistry labs, that kind of thing. And so we could have a bunch of face-to-face hours. So basically they put me in the basketball arena. There's 2 other classes in there, not at the same time, but during this semester. I have 47 sections. I have 900 students, give or take, on the roll. And they are social distance. There's tape on the chairs where they're supposed to sit. I use the $1 million Jumbotron to put my PowerPoints. And I was saying to the panelists earlier, I also take great advantage of the speaker system in there because I play music before class. It's modern US history, so I've always played music, but now I've never had speakers like I have now. So I play music as the students are filing in. I'm trying to kind of like use the space or kind of meet the challenge of the space. We can talk more about the specifics, but to get to the TA question, you know, it's interesting particularly to hear what John was saying, because from my perspective as someone who's sort of in charge of these TAs, is I wanted to take as much off of their plate as I could. So I was trying to do 2 things: not give them extra work just because of this situation, by having all the decisions made ahead of time, but then also at the same time, and I'm not sure this part's working, maybe some of my TAs are in the chat and we'll put this in the Q&A, but I'm trying to basically make all of my pedagogical decisions transparent. So anytime I make a decision, like, this is why we're doing a quiz like this is why I have a writing assignment like this is why I'm asking you to grade this paper relatively quickly with a quick turnaround on Canvas, because I'm trying to show them, look, this is the challenge that we're dealing with, and this is how I've decided to do it. And we can talk about the communication aspect of this later, I think, but then I'm just relying on them saying, this is a terrible idea, this doesn't work, or this has worked well, or this kind of student is responding well, but this other student isn't, because we've got, you know, most students aren't coming to the basketball arena to attend class, they're watching the videos online. And so dealing with all these different, you know, ways that people are learning has been a challenge. But that's sort of a nutshell introduction to what I'm doing and how I'm trying to approach the TA part of it.
Can I ask a quick follow-up right now? Have you had any TAs tell you that you have terrible ideas? I mean, do you get the sense that they feel comfortable communicating about that?
Yeah, so I have 15 teaching assistants for this one class, and 4 of them have taught before, but 11 of them are brand new to graduate school or brand new to our program, MA and PhD students. And so those are kind of a cohort that we're trying to keep together to have one singular experience as we begin. But definitely with the older students, and one of them is my advisee. She's been in the PhD program for years. And so definitely some of them have felt open to send me messages, usually not in public, but like private messages to say, you know, this is a thing that's not working, or here's the problem that I see with this plan that you have. And I've changed course as a result of that, so.
Great, thank you. So Jennifer, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about pedagogy especially, and there's a lot that's extraordinary about this moment. But I think that there's also, and we've sort of spoken about this before, there's ways in which, you know, the pandemic has also highlighted issues that are familiar from pre-COVID teaching. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, you know, what does this moment tell us about sort of good and bad practices for mentoring and teaching, teaching assistants more generally?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something I thought a lot about last spring when I was teaching the Modern European Intro Survey, which you know, with it at UVA, it's a relatively new class. I had one TA instead of the 5 or 6 that I used to have when I taught at the University of Iowa, teaching the equivalent course. But I think, you know, a lot of what Jim is talking about in terms of the challenges, you know, we found very similar kinds of things about the need for communication, for transparency, about sort of the reasoning behind assignments and lesson plans and things like that. And I was really, I think my sense was that in a lot of ways, the scramble to transition in March, kind of reinforced the importance of some of the guiding principles that I had come up with in working with TAs previously. So the Modern Europe Survey, which was, you know, it was once still called Western Civ at the University of Iowa until quite recently, was actually sort of specifically designed partly as a TA training experience. So there was a pro seminar for the graduate TAs that went alongside the TA assignment, and it was for incoming graduate students. It was often the first TA assignment for anybody who was coming in without previous teaching experience. And so I had kind of, in doing that, had come up with a set of kind of basic principles and values, including like kindness and compassion, structure, teamwork and collaboration, and that transparency and communication piece that, you know, went into designing lesson plans, went into weekly TA meetings to plan for what was coming in the week ahead, in meetings about, you know, how we were setting up and presenting assignments, how we were going to grade assignments, all of that kind of stuff. And what I found last spring was that the transition to online teaching really just kind of called for like a massive amplification of those same principles of keeping in mind, you know, that our students were panicking, you know, as Noah said, they were, you know, on planes to the 4 corners of the earth. They were locked down under really harsh conditions in places, you know, but also that my TA was locked down and panicking about, you know, he handled it beautifully. Daniel, you were awesome. But, you know, suddenly freaking out about like, what's going to happen to my dissertation project? You know, all of those kinds of things. You know, and I was panicking. I was locked down. My mom came down with COVID in the middle of March, like a week and a half after they canceled classes. So I think, you know, the need to be kind kind of went all the way down the line, and those kinds of things just became more important in the crisis.
Thank you. I think maybe this is a nice way to sort of seg into a discussion about communication. I think everyone has kind of touched on some of the challenges of communicating during the pandemic, especially when everything was in like full lockdown, but even now with these sort of hybrid type classes. So, you know, I guess I ask all of you, I'm asking all of you, you know, what has been the most challenging aspect of, you know, both communication between, you know, TAs and faculty, but then also between TAs and faculty and undergrads. And so, yeah, what have these challenges been? How have you dealt with it? I know, you know, Noah talked about this kind of loss of the community building that occurs with face-to-face. There's of course all these issues with tech, and it doesn't help to have to transition to a new platform. So yeah, I don't know if people want to just kind of jump in here.
I can take it because I'll keep it quick on my end. Because I think the hardest thing has been consistency so far, and trying to maintain a consistent platform to even communicate with students. Yeah, again, coming back to the transition to Canvas, which has its own messaging system, I get emails through that. I'll get emails through Standard Way. Somehow they found my Gmail, so I'm getting those as well. So, you know, trying to figure out how to parse out the correct way, or, you know, regardless of how many blanket emails we send to say, all right, if it's class related, use Canvas so that way we can see it. Again, they're very tech savvy students. And so, and then you introduce just a little bit of panic if a grade doesn't go their way, and suddenly there's a lot, just a, you know, shotgun blast of emails you get or messages, or, and then I mean, I guess just to throw Zoom under the bus too, you run into the issue of trying to get Zoom links that work. And for me, at least, I'm very inept with this platform. So I have a very hard time getting my office hours to work correctly from time to time. It's gotten ironed out now that the semester's gone on. But that I think that's something we could probably talk about as office hours in general. But I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I would also add on like the technical aspect. I mean, online, it's, in some ways it's fast, and in some ways it is slow in communication. You can obviously you can blast out an email in 5 seconds, but having an actual conversation, you know, trading emails that can last, you know, a day or two, it's not just a 5-minute conversation anymore. So I think in working with students, sometimes it's hard. And again, dealing with time differences if your students are back home. We have in my spring quarter class, it was a modern US history class as well. That class has a lot of international students. So for some of them, it'd probably take like a day or two to respond back to an email, or for me to get back to them. So in that way, that's challenging, just having a conversation over email. But one thing I will say, kind of tracking back to the earlier discussion about kind of planning and course design, I think it also, this moment has also allowed, for at least from my experience, like TAs to have a little bit more input in the actual course design, because these courses are being redesigned. And I feel like professors have been doing a good job at you know, asking TAs like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So I feel like we actually do have a little bit more power and saying, yeah, maybe an idea does suck, but hey, this idea is like really, really, really awesome, and I never thought about that before. So it is a kind of a trade-off in both directions.
Oh, I imagine, to throw it to Jim, that it would probably be really difficult for a first-year TA to navigate that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So one of the logistical things that I was most worried about in the beginning was this idea of how to communicate with TAs. So normally in a regular semester, I would still have 12 or 14 TAs, but I would have, we would have just a weekly meeting face-to-face in the seminar room. We would go over what we were going to talk about, what they were going to talk about in their discussion breakout sections. You know, that week we'd talk about the lectures, and we'd just kind of iron out on any of the problems that we had. And I always liked those meetings because it was everybody in a room. So even if a TA didn't ask a question, they were hearing an answer to a different question. You know how that works. So, you know, now that all translated to, we use WebEx, but it's the same as Zoom basically. And so we have a weekly WebEx meeting, but it's totally different. You know, you can tell, I mean, it just doesn't engage like it does in a seminar room, right? You can be on your phone, you can be looking, there's people walking, you know, and you're catching them at different times. And so the part of the communication thing that I think has worked well is I asked them all to basically, I don't think it's join, but whatever, participate in Microsoft Teams, which is, yes, yet another platform, right? So I'm with John, like, you're learning one thing, you're learning another thing. And it's the last thing I wanted to do, but Teams is available free on campus and I mean, through the campus, and there's training on the campus. And it was just pretty easy to use. Basically, you just create this team with my 15 TAs and me, and it's just basically like a group text. You can get it on your phone, you can get it on a computer. And so I was really trying to encourage the TAs through Teams to contact me whenever they needed to, whether it was 3 in the morning, because I can turn off my notifications and get it first thing in the morning. They can turn off their notifications, so I'm not bothering them at times. And I think it's really worked well. My evidence of this is that when a TA asks a question in Teams, a lot of times another 2 or 3 TAs will hop on that discussion, get in there and answer that question by the time I even see it. It also allows for private messages. So if the TA has a question about a specific student that everyone else doesn't want to hear about or doesn't need to hear about, then they can post on there. And that has really worked well. That's definitely one of those things I'm going to carry forward, whether we're in a pandemic or not. In terms of communicating with all of the 900 students, we're not doing a great job. You know, Canvas has these announcements, which is the easiest way for me to send out, to write the message once and have to send out to 900 people. But in getting feedback from the undergraduates who I do talk to, you know, announcements you don't get the kind of responses if you were sending an email. But I have 47 sections. It's not easy for me to like cut and paste 47 sections worth of email addresses, if you know what I mean, into it. You know what I'm saying? So that part has been complicated. I don't think I've done well. One of my undergrads who has this weird role of SI, which is supplemental instructor. So it's, I don't know if you guys have these but they're undergrads who basically do study skills stuff, but it's part of your class. Anyway, one of my SIs who I'm also meeting with every week said I should just put this all on TikTok, and then everyone in the university would see it right away. So I very quickly said no to that, but there are other solutions, I guess.
Yeah, I might add on the communication thing, just to throw more edutech companies under the bus, like Sakai. We could talk about Blackboard. You know, the learning management system that the institutions usually want us to use to communicate with students are incredibly unintuitive for everyone. They're hugely clunky, and students ignore them. Like, it is the worst way to communicate with students. And I've found, like Jim, I think email is too unwieldy, especially if you're dealing with more than one person. You lose the thread and so forth. So yeah, that kind of asynchronous chat function. I mean, I've used different things in different contexts. Google Docs, I haven't used it myself, but a lot of colleagues are using Slack, I think, with their students. So some of the tools that are out there that might be outside of the official channels are actually a lot more effective for maintaining communication over kind of that synchronous / asynchronous gap that the in-person meeting used to be able to kind of fulfill on its own. But I think the other thing is the content of communication also includes that kind of transparency piece that, you know, communication has to be, since, you know, students aren't in the classroom to raise their hand and say, wait a second, what do you mean by this? You know, have to be kind of there's a very hard balance between like explicating everything that needs to be explicated and keeping it short enough that somebody's actually going to read it from beginning to end. And so I think, you know, for me as a faculty member trying to communicate both with the TAs and with the students, that's one of the real challenges of this kind of disembodied or partially embodied experience.
I just want to add, as a historian of science, I'm really curious to observe how all these different platforms are being sort of embraced or discarded, and how communities are kind of forming around some of them and not others, and how that might break down by institution or geographical region or sort of general sensibilities of student bodies. It'll be interesting to see, you know, where it all lands, you know, I think in 6 months or a year, in terms of like new cultures related to this. Yeah. maybe we will all be on TikTok. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, related to the online format, the new vulnerabilities that are introduced by these technologies. So I think it's been very clear that there are sort of different scales and different types of vulnerabilities that are faced by students themselves, and then TAs, and then faculty. And maybe the TAs, because I think, again, you all are finding yourself on the front line dealing with students that have, tech problems, but then also personal problems and academic problems, and, are worrying about family members. And I think, TAs and, are also, I think, perhaps the most vulnerable to online harassment, either sort of in the specific space of, a Zoom session with your students, or, maybe in a slightly more attenuated form, this constant pinging for help, at 3 a.m. And so maybe describe your experience with that if you want, but then also maybe some thoughts you have on what faculty could be doing to support TAs that are having these types of issues.
Yeah, I'll start. I think for students, it could be anything from their living situation. We don't know, because everybody's working from home, we don't know if they're living with extended family. Maybe they're going back to a place maybe that it's home, but maybe isn't really a home for them. So we don't know what kind of mental or physical stress they're under. So it's hard to see that, when you're not experiencing their emotions, firsthand. And if they don't feel comfortable talking to you because they don't really know you, like they would in a regular setting. I think on the TA side, even in an in-person class, you still have to keep your boundaries, especially with time, I think. So when you're getting these plethora of emails at 3 a.m. or whatever, I think you have to even have a stronger sense of time, and keeping your space, reserving weekends, already setting that up in your in a syllabus or in your expectations. I'm not gonna answer emails past the 8 o'clock at night, and don't expect me to email you if you're emailing me at 5 o'clock in the morning either. But I think having those kind of time boundaries really takes off a lot of pressure on yourself, and I think students are understanding of that as well.
Yeah, and I can jump on that as well, because I think it kind of goes back to Jennifer's comments about sort of those fundamentals being amplified. And I think in a lot of this, it comes down to patience, if anything else, of just both, trying to ask it from the students, but also within yourself, and trying to find those boundaries and not let them, drag you into the 5 a.m. discussions about, their quiz grade and the breakdown, but also to entertain that everyone, not the 5 a.m., but in normal business hours, hear what these students have to say. For instance, we had a student crunch the numbers on our course and find out that every quiz question was worth 1% of their grade. And that scared them and scared us, because we didn't mean for that to be that way. And so that was a big conversation that I'm glad got brought up, even if it was from a student that did it, and we probably should have had it ourselves, under control. But, again, sort of it's that discussion of patience and boundaries. And I guess on that point, we had brought it up in the previous, before we went live with this, but we were talking about sort of the respondus lockdown and sort of the, panopticon style invasion of privacy that is. And that is I think that could be an interesting place for the conversation to go, as in terms of putting TAs sort of in this very, at least personally for me, uncomfortable situation of having to watch, all these kids take tests in their rooms, in their homes or living situations, and sort of where the line gets drawn with that. Because I'm not sure, at least at my institution, we've figured out where to do that. I know the discussions with the professor I'm TAing for, we sort of go back and forth as to what is too much, what is too little, and haven't found a consensus on it yet. But I think it's something that I'm curious to see how it looks a half year from now, or what legal challenges come from it from that perspective. So anyway.
I would add one point before we get to the panopticon thing. And this gets back to something I said earlier when Alex asked the question about whether TAs are comfortable in saying things to me. And this underscores, I think, why this moment puts TAs in a position they've never been in before. I think the lack of attendance, you know, the lower attendance, and I think the lack of personal interaction between students and TAs has allowed students here, and this is just maybe an observation about us, but has allowed students here to kind of to change the relationship with the TA. They're a little more curt in their communication, if they're communicating at all. But I had a TA come to me and say, you know, your students are reading these late 19th century documents where, you know, the subject, the primary sources are using words that aren't appropriate today, they were appropriate then, but students are using them when they're not quoting in the documents. It's not an entirely new problem, but it's the kind of problem that you can very easily solve. Like, students generally don't want to be using things that are inappropriate, but they just don't know. And so this was a harder thing to solve when you can't have a one-on-one interaction with a student. And so I ended up having to post an announcement to all 900 students, like explaining language. Now, maybe that was more effective than it would have been in a normal class, like in a normal year, but I don't think so. I think that it's the kind of thing that if a TA just explained in a discussion section, it would have, I think, a lot more power than me sending out a Canvas announcement about language. So I was very thankful that the student came to me and said that. I did in the announcement say there would be a penalty if students continue to do this, and I think it's mostly cut out. But that's that kind of like face-to-face reaction thing that puts TAs in a position where now they're having to read stuff they wouldn't have normally, I think, had to read. I don't have much to add on the cheating thing. I'm being forced right now to give my students. Okay, ready for this? I'm embarrassed to be saying this in an actual recorded AHA webinar, but multiple choice exams, because I have 900 students. My TAs have either 40 or 60 students each, and I don't want them having to grade essay question exams 3 times a year. Normally they would have blue books. You know, the students would be filling them out in class, but of course we're not spreading COVID through blue books. So I decided that that Canvas would grade everybody's test. There would be a multiple choice exams, and that in the weeks they don't have exams, so most of the weeks during the semester, they'll write a short essay on Canvas responding to a question. So the TAs are still doing a lot of grading, but because I didn't want them to have to wade through all those exams, I went to multiple choice exams. And I haven't gone to the anti-cheating route other than just trying to write questions that aren't very easily Googleable and those kind of traditional things.
I think one of the things that you know, that Noah and John remind us of is the responsibility of faculty to kind of create both course design and kind of day-to-day, week-to-week structures that could have protect and reinforce those boundaries on time, on kind of unreasonable demands. So part of that kind of principle of teamwork is, you know, we have each other's backs. So, you know, the TAs and the faculty members are working together to kind of make it functional for themselves as well as for their shared students. But I think there are a couple of other things that are worth pointing out. And one is, I think especially, you know, in a situation like yours, Jim, where you have a large number of TAs, that some of those pre-existing sort of inequities in the way that students interact with TAs on the basis of race and gender, you know, regional accent, what have you, are amplified again by the culture of the internet. And that, you know, faculty really need to be aware of the fact that rules that you might establish with kind of certain assumptions about the way that students will sort of view and respond to their TAs are not going to be universal for TAs who are coming to the class from different places. But the other vulnerability, I think, is the vulnerability of our undergrads. And, you know, one of the unfortunate things that happens is that sometimes TAs harass their students, and that the online context attenuates some of the oversight and some of the kind of communication between the faculty member and the undergraduates that creates a channel for reporting, sort of finding out about and dealing with any problems that arise there. So I think, you know, sort of extra awareness, again, of a lot of those kind of things that we always knew, but that are just so much bigger because of the different medium, is really important to keep in mind, and really the faculty members' responsibility. That should, none of those things should be on the TAs to be establishing or enforcing.
We want to transition to Q&A pretty soon, but I like an open sort of Q&A period, but I want to kind of end with a broader question if people want to maybe comment, you know, very quickly. And so sort of thinking about beyond the pandemic, right? So, you know, for better or worse, TA assignments constitute a large part of the teaching experience that graduate students have, right? This is part of being a graduate student, is teaching. And this is often how they learn to teach, right? There are very few PhD programs where you don't have any teaching experience. And I think that it's actually quite important that graduate students, you know, learn to teach. But what are the pedagogical stakes of this system, right? Where graduate students, you know, in terms of like, what are the stakes for the graduate students to be sort of both student and teacher? What are the stakes for the undergraduate students, you know, that are being instructed by individuals that are in this dual role? And then I think this is part of what Jennifer was already talking about. You know, what do faculty owe the graduate students that they are training to teach? And are there kind of lessons that we can take from this COVID moment, right? It's not even a moment, right? It's been dragged out for months now. But our experience, you know, during the pandemic, and to think about, you know, how to organize and mentor TAs in a way that prepare them to teach while also enriching undergraduate education. And I'll throw one last little bit in there. Is there anything specific to teaching history that, you know, might factor in here as well? And, you know, we all got all the, you know, sort of announcements of like learning or webinars from the Centers for Teaching and Learning on how to like plan your class this summer, although maybe the TAs didn't, right? But the, but you know, often I found those were not necessarily that helpful for thinking about how to construct a history course and the specific skills that we want undergraduates to learn in terms of thinking historically. So if everyone wants to sort of jump in quickly, and then maybe we can pivot over to the Q&A period. Or not everyone, if anyone wants to jump in.
I'll just say quickly.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was going to say, I think one of the things that it really has done for me is it's made me really rethink very hard what I want students to get out of a history course. And really, I think in a lot of ways, move much further away than I was before, already, I think, shifting, but away from kind of the accumulation of facts and towards creating kind of creating a forum for genuine engagement with the past and its relationship to the present. And so I think that, you know, sort of, creating opportunities for really authentic engagement with real historical thinking and real historical questions and what it means, especially at the survey level, for students who may never take another history class in their lives, is much more important than whether they remember the exact sequence of, you know, phases of the French Revolution.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would say my first day of class this year, you know, the only day that all 900 students showed up, I tried to make this point. And I tried to say that if you've lived through the last 6 months, you've lived through all these moments that echo to these points in American history. And I believe that this is the hardest I've ever worked to teach a class. It's also the easiest I've ever had to reach students with history. You know, I lectured about the flu pandemic, which I'd never done before in a US survey before. And it was just like, people were engaged with that lecture. Even the people who just watched it online were emailing me questions about it and stuff. And so I think we really got to take advantage of this moment, as Jennifer says, to connect students to using history to understand that connection between the past and the present.
I'd like to jump in on that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. No, that was just a great segue for the one point I wanted to say, which was, in trying to quickly organize a course to fit on Canvas, the one thing that I at least took from it from the TA perspective was the importance of maintaining that discussion section or some form of community and discussion within the history course to allow exactly what both you and Jennifer were talking about in terms of trying to connect it with the moment and the discussion of history sort of writ large and how that affects these students who may only get to take this class once or twice. So that was sort of our solution, was 20-minute discussion sections, just to make sure, even if it wasn't the full class, these students would have something to be able to talk to each other about, talk to us about, and it not just be multiple choice quizzes. So
I think for me, it's something that I heard from Jennifer, and thinking about like your pedagogical values or your structure of your class. And I think it's so important moving from in-person to online to maintain those same values. Of course, the medium of that learning, that teaching is different. But I think if you have a firm structure and you stick to it, I think it'll make the online experience a little better. But I think it's just so important to foster that environment online, and staying true to some kind of pedagogical structure. Of course, it's going to be redesigned for a new format, but if you go in with no structure, you're going to have a hard time. And I've seen it from on two different ends of the spectrum, being really organized and kind of going into it with like not really a plan. It's always good to have a plan, and you can always adapt from there, but no plan is not a good plan. And I think, and lastly, kind of going back to Alex's last question about history, I think one thing that was interesting that I saw in terms of like research, how do you get students to, if you're assigning like research papers, with libraries being shut down, with archives and different forms of access not being available, how do we rethink research, especially at an undergrad level, with different access to sources and materials? Yeah.
Can I add one quick thing that I think gets to this idea of training graduate students? And that is, this moment underscores that programs have to be training graduate students to teach in all kinds of different situations. If you're just doing face-to-face discussion sections for your TAs, you're not training them for the real world. You've got to be giving them exposure to online classes, big lectures, small classes, discussion classes, all kinds of different formats. And it's, I think, the responsibility of graduate programs to make sure they're training their students to do all those different things.
Great. You all managed to just sort of collectively set up the first question that came from the audience, I think, here, about, how important is it for TAs to be technically savvy? I mean, is this a new skill that we might now expect of them? And then what are the sort of obligations of the institutions to train them and to not simply, send the invitations to Center of Teaching and Learning webinars to the faculty, but to everybody?
Yeah, I can jump on this because I do think, having gone through sort of the baptism by fire this last fall, it is really important that, whether it's, somewhere up the chain of command in a department, that someone, loops in TAs, at least into whether it's the faculty trainings, I would hope into some sort of more broad faculty discussions about these teaching platforms, either before they're implemented or just after, just to have the TA, if not even to participate, at least just to watch sort of the faculty's thinking, so we can better orient ourselves as to how we're going to do this. It was something I wish we had done. And I get the sense that from my department, it was so quick that there wasn't even a chance for that. We were just in the semester. So any type of, whether it be informal or formal sort of looping of TAs would be extremely useful. And to the question of whether or not TAs are tech savvy, I almost think that kind of behooves the faculty who have the TAs to sort of, read the room with their personalities, whether these are, Luddite, folks who want to be in the books, and maybe the faculty needs to take a slightly, you know, whether it's getting them the training or having that kind of discussion, or if a faculty member can kind of back off and let the TA take the reins on the tech stuff. I think it's tough to put a blanket on all TAs because, I mean, especially from the historian's perspective, we're all, you know, there's a reason we do history. So maybe not the history of science, but the rest of it.
I also, same boat as John, definitely not tech savvy, going into online. What is this Zoom thing? I think that was a question for everybody though. What is Zoom? It just kind of came out of nowhere, and we're supposed to use this platform. We don't know what early on with the Zoom bombings and that kind of stuff. We didn't know like what the privacy was like, what the security was like. But I think yes, there needs to be more training for TAs, for faculty, and also for the students as well. Because we're all trying to learn this at the same time, learning about the capabilities of the platforms that we're expected to use, what tools actually work, what tools don't work. It's just been an adjustment, but I think especially for the TAs and the students, because I think those are the people who are interacting. I mean, that's kind of like the first point of contact, right, between those two parties, getting the necessary training for them.
I mean, maybe to go back a little bit to your last question, Alex, I have kind of two, like one kind of big ethical response and one very practical response to this. And one is that, you know, I feel like, you know, maybe the exception to patience is the like, you know, toleration of somebody waving their hands and just saying, oh, I'm not tech savvy. Like, there's really no excuse. You know, it's your job. If you're the faculty member, it's your responsibility to learn how it works and to give your TAs the resources they need to learn how it works. Even if that means calling in outside experts, right? Teaching is a collaborative enterprise, and there are lots of really skilled professionals on our campuses with a lot more knowledge than any of us, so use them. But the other thing is, you know, sort of from a very practical standpoint, you know, the first assignment that we did after the transition to online classes last March was basically a tech quiz where every student had to successfully log into and access each of the technologies and platforms we were going to be using for the rest of the semester and post, you know, something silly, right? You know, a picture of the thing that was making them happy right now, you know, the meme that described their current situation best, or like whatever. But just that, like, you know, and there were points attached. You know, it was very low effort, but making sure everybody could access the technology was the first step before we did anything else.
I like this way of thinking about, yeah, that this is another part of training students, but that this is a critically important part, right? I mean, you can't even begin to, you know, if you're so dependent on this technology, you can't even begin to use it if you can't trust that your students are actually going to be able to receive it, which actually I think gets to maybe the next question. I know right now there aren't so many asynchronous courses being taught, or at least at our institution. They're mostly all synchronous if they're not face-to-face. But back in the spring, right, a number of courses went asynchronous pretty quickly. And so just so it's totally clear to everyone, maybe the terminology is not always obvious, but back in the spring when everything switched to online, you could either keep the same schedule, keep holding your lectures, everyone needs to log in and attend and be part of your lectures. So that's a synchronous course. And then asynchronous is when, you know, you pre-record your lectures, the discussions exist as discussion boards. No one needs to be anywhere at a particular time. There might be some deadlines for assignments, but for the most part, time is meaningless. And so the question is, you know, what suggestions do you have for improving accessibility in the classroom for synchronous and asynchronous history classes? And I know this was a real issue in Mississippi, especially because the students kind of scattered to the wind in the spring. They were often in places where they didn't have very good internet. So again, asynchronous courses were, you know, a way to be accommodating because they didn't, you know, it didn't require that students need to be somewhere with good internet at a specific time. But you also, you know, I don't know, I remember when I was recording these lectures. It was just like putting a message in a bottle and sort of flinging it out, you know, and you just had no idea if people were receiving any of it. But anyway, you all should talk, not me.
Yeah, I'll jump on this one. The class that I TA'd for in the spring was actually asynchronous. I actually did like it because we didn't have to all be at the same place at the same time, especially again, our class was maybe not like 95% international students, so a lot of them did go back home and the time differences were really crazy. But I think one thing that I liked from my professor that I TA'd for, especially because we were putting a lot of, you know, the lectures, and she'd put in like links to videos. She actually did a good job in and thinking about, you know, how are students learning, and especially with international students who are ESL. So I think she used, I'm not sure what the software that she was using was, but she did like a captioning software where she could, you know, put the captions for all the videos. We did some like, they had to listen to some radio clips from the mid 20th century. So I thought that was great. And that's even beyond COVID and being asynchronous, I think that's good, even just thinking about students who have disabilities in learning or in any capacity. But I think that was a pretty unique challenge that we kind of just take for granted in a regular classroom space.
Yeah, I would just echo that. You know, the first day of class, I had one of my TAs take a picture of this basketball arena and all these students facing the Jumbotron, and I tweeted it, "This is my first day of teaching," or "Welcome to my classroom," or something, and it got like thousands of retweets or something. But I read through all of the positive and negative comments, and one of the comments was, "There's no way that this is like ADA compliant, the space and the text on the Jumbotron." And ever since seeing that tweet, I've paid close attention to just that. And but I think the reality is for students always have the option of attending my class and or watching the recorded version that I have to put up, where it's just me talking over slides. But then you know, the text is on the screen. You can get the subtitles automatically added through Canvas. So I think actually that some of the, now people should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the accessibility issues are better when you have at least this kind of double class online and in person.
Yeah, I think what Noah and Jim say about kind of just basic principles of accessibility that already exist for disability accommodations apply here as well. And I think sort of concretely, one of the important things for me was finding out ahead of time what my students' sort of technological access capacities were and what kind of needs they had ahead of time. So, you know, surveying students about what kind of internet access they had, what kind of devices they were going to be using, helped me figure out that, you know, I couldn't just post the video of my lecture, which I tried to keep really short anyway, because who wants to watch a lecture online? But, you know, also posting the audio in a podcast format that could be easily downloaded to a phone, and then putting the slides up in, you know, again, another kind of fairly light format that students working with limited bandwidth could get onto a device that they actually had. So finding out ahead of time and then talking to, you know, the experts out there in online teaching who've already figured out how to answer these questions, and using the answers that somebody else had already come up with, or some of the tools that other people had already come up with, was really helpful for me.
Yeah, and I
go ahead, John.
One quick thing, just because it was sort of a unintended, I guess, positive out of A&M's current stance of trying to do, I think it's like 60% face-to-face, and then the rest asynchronous or online, is that we have a lot more students that are back on campus now, and because of it have access to the library, or at the very least the text aspects of the library. So we've, from the disabilities perspective at least, where they didn't have it in the spring, now have access to a lot more of the sort of robust on-campus places they can go and resources that they otherwise wouldn't. I mean, say what you will about having students back on campus, but at the very least, that's something they didn't have in spring that they do now. So,
I think, I mean, you've all sort of talked around it a little bit. This idea of sort of accessibility to Wi-Fi, and the way that you framed it, Jennifer, I mean, it makes me think about this, you know, really should be an institution-wide discussion about, you know, the student body and the specific needs of the student body. I mean, again, you know, in Mississippi, there are, you know, very rural areas where there is, I mean, not even a cell signal, you know, let alone, you know, are you able to get, you know, I think good enough Wi-Fi to be able to stream a video. I know that in the spring I had to actually post my things at the times that I said I was going to do it, because I had students scheduling, you know, to go to the local public library where there would be enough, you know, strong enough wireless for them to be able to watch my lectures. But I mean, maybe people want to comment on, I mean, we know that this pandemic has exacerbated, you know, financial struggles for everyone. And you know, now that everything or lots of things are online, you know, how is this sort of additionally exacerbated access to education?
I mean, this is a huge issue. And I think one of the, to go back to the question of faculty responsibilities, it seems to me that one of the things that's incumbent on us as members of the faculty is to be aware of what our institutions are doing, and what, if we're, you know, public institutions, what our state governments and legislatures are doing to help students who are find themselves in precarious situations, you know, whether it's a question of internet access or they need, you know, a laptop for the semester or whatever, to food and housing insecurity, and to be ready to connect our students with the resources that are there, because we're the ones who may become aware of that, or they may not be in a position to get the information for themselves. So I think that's an added responsibility for faculty.
Yeah, and I would say that cuts both ways. Faculty have to be much better about understanding the resources that the university is making available, and should pay more attention to university decisions. And I don't count complaining on Facebook as engaging in a productive conversation with your administration. There's way too much of that happens, or Twitter, or pick your platform. But you know, most university administrators who I know are more than happy to let you behind the curtain if you just know what kinds of questions to ask. But university administrators, that's the second part, have to do a lot better too about just making sure that faculty know about, you know, where the food bank is, how often a student can go, you know, all the different resources that these big modern universities have for students, which are amazing and important. But I think some of this communication still is left off.
I want to bundle a couple questions together here. People have been asking sort of about specific kind of classroom mechanics, I guess. So, you know, doing peer review during in-person sections versus remote, you know, sort of sections. Is it possible to do it asynchronous or synchronous? And then also maybe thinking about office hours. I know we talked very briefly about that, or sort of mentioned, but if there, you know, do you schedule Zoom office hours, or do you sit in front of your WebEx camera waiting for someone to show up? I mean, has office hours changed, I think, under these specific circumstances? And yeah, I'll leave it at that. And then we have, I think, 2 or 3 more kind of big questions that hopefully we can get to.
I can jump in on the office hours real quick. Mostly just to tell the story about how we sort of had an organic review group spring up among our students that I now, like, so what I schedule office hours and I sit in front of the webcam and just wait essentially for however many hours I need to be there. And I will get 1 or 2 students every week that are essentially the representatives of this group me conversation happening somewhere in the ether where they compile a list of questions and then are sent to me to answer them, and then they go back into the ether and disseminate it amongst their colleagues. And I don't know if that's necessarily the most effective way to do it. I mean, there's students teaching themselves instead of coming to me or the professor, but it is one of those sort of unintended communities that have now sprung up around this class through use of, I guess, back to the discussion of a third-party platform that isn't, you know, through the school. But it seems to be working well, even if it does mean I sit there for an hour and a half and wait for one student to show up. But so long as they're getting the information, I'm happy with it.
I think one thing that we had expected with the online change was that we were going to get an increase in student feedback or contact via email, or like, you know, where our office hours are going to be flooded, and we're like, oh no. That kind of, for so far, it's been pretty much the exact opposite. Not really much participation in office hours. Ours are kind of scheduled where you just set an hour, and students can make an appointment. And even we did in the spring quarter, we also did like midterm reviews before the midterm. I think before the midterm and before the final, where we just schedule like blocks of time. You can just jump into our Zoom meeting, and so it was me and the other TA talking to each other for an hour, and because nobody came. But I think that kind of goes back to what we've been talking to before, like that loss of that human interaction between the TA and the student, where I think students might not feel comfortable, you know, being in this like awkward Zoom setting, talking to a TA that they've never met before in person. It's probably their first time actually like verbalizing, communicating, not on email or electronically with the TA. So that might be a little awkward or intimidating. So I think thinking about other ways to maybe make earlier contact in the semester or quarter, where I don't think it might not be helpful to force people to, you know, have scheduled, you know, you got to do a check-in on this day, but I don't know, it might work, it might not work. But just thinking about ways to make students feel more comfortable about, you know, okay, we're here, this is our job, we're supposed to be helping you. Don't be ashamed of you know, jumping in Zoom and asking questions.
Thank you. So I think go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think, you know, John said something really important that I think maybe might get lost, is the importance of students being in communication with each other, and in addition to kind of the office hours. And one of the things that my TA and Ed talked about at the end of last spring was, you know, that if we were going to do it again, that we actually would have required some kind of periodic, like, human contact with one of us, you know, by appointment, office hours, student's choice, but like, let us have some like live interaction. There's some circumstance to make sure everyone's alive. But then also we had talked about like creating some kind of structure of collaboration, you know, whether it's study groups that were responsible for keeping kind of collaborative notes or coming up with collaborative answers to things so that students are in contact with each other as well, which might be more comfortable for them. I also, since you mentioned peer review, I don't know if we're allowed to advertise some good educational technology, but I want to give like a big shout out to a company called Peerceptive that does online peer review of writing, which I've actually been using for a number of years, like pre-COVID, and I think it is absolutely magical. And it really, it works incredibly well as a mechanism for peer review, much better than anything I've ever done in person in class. So I will make an unabashed pitch, and hopefully someday Peerceptive will start paying me a commission for this. But I put their website in the chat, and I'll come up with, I wrote a little blog about it a couple of weeks ago for UVA that I'll add about how it works. But peer review is excellent, and Peerceptive is awesome.
Great, thank you. So when we talked about accessibility just a few minutes back, we were talking about accessibility for people with disabilities. We talked about accessibility when you lack Wi-Fi, or sort of, and I think implicit in that was also maybe a discussion of poverty. But here's a question from one of the people in the audience. What measures do you think institutions can take to support history, African-American and Black faculty, graduate and undergrad students whose pre-existing institutional and interpersonal challenges are now being furthered by COVID era circumstances? So again, sort of specific communities that are vulnerable and how this gets exacerbated even more.
So I think in general, this gets back to the point I was making earlier about, the responsibility that faculty have. And I'm new to this responsibility, to be honest, like the responsibility that we have to connect with the rest of the university and to make sure that we totally understand what the entire life is like for our colleagues and for our students, graduate and undergraduate students. Resources sometimes that we might assume our university has, maybe because the PhD place where we went had those resources, we just assume those are here. Or we assume, I don't know, because we're in a poor state or because of whatever, we might not have access to things, might not have resources that we actually do. I had an experience yesterday with a student, and basically the student has a problem. And I was able to email someone who I know in the university and say, this probably isn't in your office, but I knew you and I had your email address, and how can you help? And the answer that I got back explained the mechanisms of how the university works in a way that was incredibly helpful, not for just that student, but for like a bunch of my students. And it's those kinds of, that kind of information that I think faculty don't always get, which is partly our fault and partly the fault of the, but just being aware of all of the resources is the first step, I think, in making sure that all of our colleagues and students have the resources that they need.
I think maybe related to that is also something we talked about early on, that people are trying to be helpful right now. I mean, I think that you will get sort of, a long, sort of heavy on the explanation email from, some random office on campus now that maybe you wouldn't have gotten a year ago, because I think everyone is trying to fix this communication gap and try and bridge it.
Yeah, I think this is a place where it may be a little bit separate from the TA question, but where faculty governance becomes really important, and being in touch also with, your faculty assembly, your faculty senate or whatever, so that, if your dean shows up at a campus-wide meeting and tells, a female faculty member of color with health risks for COVID, that she has a moral obligation to be a model of bravery to her students and teach in person. The faculty are on the horn immediately to make clear that that's not okay, and to use the institutional levers and power that they have to prevent institutional discrimination. I mean, I think that, because that's really the word, right, is discrimination. And there are, faculty of color have particular vulnerabilities. People have other kinds of risks, invisible and visible. And we have like a responsibility not to allow institutions to ignore those.
And it seems like it's too pointed, but I would just totally underscore what Jennifer said and say that complaining on Facebook is not an official lever for getting to the administration. In fact, that doesn't help, right? So working through the university and the faculty senate is the way to do it.
I think coming from maybe like the grad student side, and similar to what Jennifer said, I think it comes down to accountability, especially, I'll just kind of simmering and thinking about like different scenarios that could come up as, as like a TA of color, or if you belong to like some kind of minority background, maybe you have a discussion section on maybe a serious topic or controversial topic, and things might have been said, and you don't have that same, because you're online, you can't have that same maybe immediate response to call that person out, So those kind of things might, happen. So I think it does kind of fall on the professor who's teaching that class to back their students up, to have their students back, just like as you would in a regular setting. But I think again we're in like this kind of new waters of online teaching. So how do we keep ourselves accountable? How do we deal with those kind of issues if they come up, like in the classroom setting, when we're not in person?
I think these are, these are all excellent points. And I'm sort of thinking now, it's the end of October. So all of the planning for the spring term or the winter quarter, the spring semester is happening. And this is an opportunity for one thing, all these universities are trying to transition to something else again. But I think this is also a point where TAs and faculty can sort of, work these new lines of communication and sort of, again, as Noah was saying, there's this moment right now, this opportunity for TAs to be sort of more involved in thinking about course planning. But then I think also this is a moment where faculty can really start pushing on these levers of power and use the power that they have, and to sort of pay attention to what the administration is doing and to actively pursue better pedagogy across the board. And I think Emily is telling me that it's about time to wrap up, and I hope she is in charge of wrapping up because I don't have any sort of big summarizing things to say.
Hello there, Alix. I don't have any summarizing things to say either, except an enormous thank you to you and the rest of the panelists. This was a really engaging conversation. For those whose questions we didn't get to in the Q&A because of time issues, we will try to follow up with you separately. But thank you so much to everyone who attended, and thank you especially to the panelists. I think this is a really important conversation about how teaching happens at the university and how learning to teach happens at the university, all of which has been highlighted even more in, I guess this present moment doesn't count if it goes on for forever. But I thank all of you for your insight and your candor, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for providing your insights to everyone who attended.